and the girls troop. So we have about 14 active girls, started in 2019, so this is our third year. And we are probably one of the most active troops in the valley, very high adventure oriented. We do a camp out every month. And we really like to focus on backpacking. We've done 50 milers every year. We are doing an upcoming camp out, floating the Green River in Canyonlands, in Canyonlands over spring break. So we have quite a few active girls, and we also will be having our first Eagle Scout girl. If Elsa would please stand up. And she will be the first one that got her Eagle Scout as of Thursday. So what I'd like to share with you is some of the things that I think that are different than the girls and the boys. One thing I'm very proud of the girls is that they follow, there's 12 points to the Scout Law, and the girls are very great at being friendly, courteous, and kind. And one thing that's very touching to me is I have a daughter who has some very special needs, and the girls in our troop, the 14 girls, are so patient, kind, and gentle with helping my daughter with advancing through her Scout career. And that's what is very touching for me, that I've noticed that's different than the boys' troop, is just the camaraderie and the compassion that the girls have. Now, they are a little weak on their knots, so we got to work on knots. And then the last thing that's very important in Scouts, and at least to me, is it's a big factor, the duty to God. Duty to God. And with every rank advancement, with every girl, I have to sit down one-on-one with the girls, with adults and kids in the distance. We follow youth protection very strictly. But I get to ask them, what is your duty to God? That's one of the requirements to ask them, and how they follow the Scout Law. What's neat when you ask them what their duty to God is, the various answers you get, from everything from being nice to reading their Bible daily. And so that's a really neat, special time that I get to do as a Scoutmaster, one-on-one with the girls. And of course, we end every Monday meeting with a Scout prayer that one of the Scouts will give, and Vespers. So those are just some of the things we do with the girls, and the boys do stuff a little different, but it's a great activity. If you have kids or girls that want to join, please join.
Great. Thanks so much. They'll be out in the lobby if you want information about how you can be part of the Scout Troop, or you can always email me and I can connect you also. Just a reminder, in your worship folder is an envelope. That's the pledge envelope. If you haven't had a chance to fill that out for this year or to sign up for electronic giving, I encourage you to consider that, do that this season. And then last, I want to remind you that Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. Ash Wednesday is the start of the church season of Lent. As we prepare for Easter, we go through 40 days, not counting Sundays, that we call Lent. And in this season, it's a time where we look kind of introspectively, and we often begin with this awkward, could be a religious moment where we literally put ashes on our forehead and we remember and we hear those ancient words, from dust you were created and to dust you will return. And we're reminded that life is a moment. And so Ash Wednesday, for us, we will have a service at 7 o'clock over on the Cathedral side, 7 o'clock. Or if you want to just come early in the day for the imposition of ashes at 8 o'clock in the chapel from 8 to 9, or from noon to 1 if you're downtown. So there's 3 chances to kind of come and have your Ash Wednesday moment. So get your ash in church, all right? I only get to say that once a year, so that's okay. All right, it's Transfiguration Sunday, it's Scout Sunday. If you stay with me a minute, you might see these actually fit together. The Transfiguration story is the story of Jesus that takes place in the Gospel of Luke. It's also in Matthew and Mark, but we're going to look at it in Luke's Gospel today, in chapter 9 and verse 28. So let me read these words. About 8 days after saying this, he, Jesus, climbed the mountain to pray. And taking Peter and John and James along, while he was in prayer, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became blinding white. At once, 2 men were there talking with him. They turned out to be Moses and Elijah. What a glorious appearance they made. They talked over his exodus, the one Jesus was about to complete in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Peter and those with him were slumped over in sleep, and when they came to, rubbing their eyes, they saw Jesus in his glory and 2 men standing with him. When Moses and Elijah had left, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, this is a great moment. Let's build 3 memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He blurted this out without thinking. While he was babbling on like this, a light, radiant cloud enveloped them. As they found themselves buried in the cloud, they became deeply aware of God. Then there was a voice out of the cloud. "This is my son, the chosen. Listen to him." And the story ends with this verse. When the sound of the voice died away, they saw Jesus was there alone. They were speechless. And they continued speechless, saying not one thing to anyone during the days of what they had seen. This is a wild story, right? I mean, Jesus is kind of camping in the mountains with 3 friends. It's a kind of an Idaho story, kind of a scouting story. It feels very familiar. And then there's this weird moment of Elijah and Moses, who've been long dead, appearing alive with Jesus. It's a mystical moment. Sometimes we want our faith to be fact. Jesus slept here, Jesus walked here. We want it to be like a historical fact, but a lot of our faith is mystical, unexplainable, just unique experiences of God. Albert Einstein put it like this. He said, "The most beautiful and profound emotion we can experience is the sensation of the mystical. It's the source of all true science to know that what is impenetrable to us really exists. This knowledge, this feeling is the center of true religion." Wow. So Jesus is praying on the mountaintop. There's so many sermons in this. When Jesus is praying and he's changed, that should tell us what prayer should do to us. Jesus is praying and he's physically changed. He looks different. And every preacher loves the next part, and his friends fall asleep. Because if it happened to Jesus, it's okay if it happens to me, right? His friends fall asleep. And in the midst of that, then we get these Moses and Elijah there. We get a transformation taking place. We get Simon Peter saying, "Let's stay here on the mountaintop." That's what most of us do in those high holy moments. We think, can't we just live here? This is great. Brian Zahn, one of my favorite authors, he writes, "The Bible itself is a mystical book. It was produced by Jewish and Christian mystics filled with the Holy Spirit. The text that became sacred did not come from people who were merely thinking about God, but from people who had a direct experience with God." If you stay in the story and you go back to Mark, when Mark tells a story, the Greek word that's translated transformation or that tells us of the change that takes place in Jesus is the Greek word that is metamorphosis. Metamorphosis. It's a zoological term that we use to explain how an immature species becomes a mature species. There's a lot of maturing in the story taking place. And again, if you think about it, scouting's about maturing as a leader, about maturing as a young adult, about maturing as a camper, about maturing as a citizen. And this story is about maturing. But it began with that odd phrase, about 8 days after he said this. So we have to ask, well, what was the this? I mean, you set up a story with this premise, but we don't know what the this is. So go back in the Gospel of Luke, and there's this moment 8 days before where Jesus is with the disciples, and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" I mean, that'd be a great lunch conversation. Who do you say Jesus is? Who do you say Jesus is? Simon Peter gives that response, "You are the Christ." And a metamorphosis, a change begins. And Jesus begins to explain to him, you're right, but not the way you expect. I am the Christ, but I'm not going to lead a political movement that's changing our world. I am the Christ, but I'm not getting rid of the Roman occupying army. I am the Christ, but I'm going to suffer as the Christ. I'm going to die as the Christ. And I'm going to live in life beyond life, resurrection as the Christ. And then Jesus gets into, my best choice of words is some Jesus-y talk. There's some Jesus-y things he says that you go, what? Jesus says, so if you're going to follow me, you got to take up your cross. That's kind of a, what? Jesus continues and says, if you want to save your life, you have to lose it. And then he says, which is a good word to those in the midst of war, what good is it to gain the whole world if you lose your soul? And then the text says there's silence for 8 days. I think that's I'm always intrigued what the writer includes in the story. You know, there was silence for 8 days. I mean, sometimes for us to go through the metamorphosis of who God is and what God's doing, we need some silence. Sometimes we need some distance. I mean, we talked about a couple weeks ago, the normal journey of faith is we find Jesus, and then we lose Jesus, and then we find Jesus again, and then we have to redefine who Jesus is. And that's exactly what's taking place again in the story. The disciples have Jesus, you're the Christ, and Jesus says yes, but there's a metamorphosis taking place, and they have to wrestle with, can we do that? And we hear a little hesitancy on the mountain. Why don't we stay here and just build some tabernacles instead of doing that Jerusalem stuff? The mountains are often places where people experience a closeness to God, the majesty of God. It's in the mountains that Moses gets the 10 Commandments. It's in the mountains that Elijah the prophet, who's running for his life, hears God speak in an unexpected way. The mountains are often thin places where the reality of earth and heaven are close. Anatoly Bugarov, a mountain climber, says, mountains are not stadiums where I satisfy my ambition to achieve. They are cathedrals where I practice my religion. Life gives us mystical experiences, mountaintop moments, thin places. Sarah Miles was 46 years old when she had that mystical experience of the presence of God. She grew up unfamiliar to the church, but that day she walked into a church, was offered a piece of bread and a sip of wine. Up to that moment, she said, I had no interest in religion. I'd never prayed the Lord's Prayer, never read the Bible, not raised in a religious home, never been baptized. But that day she entered St. Gregory of Nyssa's Episcopal Church in San Francisco. And when she entered, someone invited her to Holy Communion. And Sarah writes, and then something outrageous and terrifying happened. Jesus happened to me. She said, I felt dizzy, I felt changed, I felt filled with life. in her memoir, the book called Take This Bread, she writes, Holy Communion knocked me upside down. It forced me to deal with the impossible reality of God. It's a metamorphosis, a maturing. She goes on to say, as my conversion continued relentlessly challenging my assumptions about religion, about politics, about meaning of life, God forced me to deal with all kinds of people. Her mountaintop experience was wandering into a church, experiencing what we call Holy Communion. And it created in her a hunger to literally feed the people in her community. She wanted everyone to be able to come to the table, not just for communion, but for food. And so she created a food pantry in her church that every week feeds 500 people, 500 families. I mean, we get so excited about the Amity Food Pantry feeding 40 families a week. 500 families a week experience the presence of God at the same table where she experienced the mystery of God. Christianity is not a set of beliefs. Christianity is not a set of doctrines. Christianity is a way of discovery. The discovery of God's love and grace and mercy and forgiveness of God found in Jesus. It's a constant metamorphosis. Another piece of this story for me that I wanted to pick up today was that voice, right? They're on the mountain. Moses, Elijah are there. The cloud envelops them. They feel the presence of God. Then there's this voice that says, this is my son, the chosen. Listen to him. Could it be that metamorphosis, that change comes if we would only listen to Jesus? Earlier in the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 6, when Jesus is doing Luke's recording his version of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, verse 27, Jesus says, but to you who are willing to listen, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. Maturity is even loving our enemies in a world built for war. How do you do that? How do you love your enemy? It was September 1962 when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King attended a week-long Christian leadership conference in Birmingham, Alabama. And at the time, 1962, Birmingham was one of the most segregated cities in America. Segregated. Swimming pools, segregated schools, parks, bathrooms, drinking fountains, fitting rooms, checkout stands at the grocery, signs everywhere that said whites only or colored. The crusade to preserve segregation was so extreme at the time that a children's book had been banned in libraries and public schools and stores because it had black and white sheep on the cover, as if they could be friends. Tensions were so high, and Bull Connor, at the time the Commissioner of Public Safety, he had dispersed a rally of school children by knocking them off their feet with fire hoses and unleashing attack dogs on them. At the time, African Americans were routinely lynched, castrated, raped, spat upon. Their churches were vandalized, their civic leaders were beaten, their neighborhoods where black activists lived were bombed so many times that the newspaper called it Dynamite Hill. It was into this tension, this racial tension, that Dr. King came